Yeah, so we can start, Neeraj.
Okay, so namaste everyone. I am Neeraj Rastogi, and today are having another lecture. So before the lecture start, let me briefly introduce you with the IASTA. So IASTA is a professional organization for scientists and engineers who are striving to advance aerosol research in the Indian context. The association provides a platform for exchanging knowledge and resources. It disseminates information among researchers, member organizations, industrial counterparts, and related disciplines by organizing conferences, technical meetings, lectures like this, and publications. ASTA addresses various interests such as environmental science, air pollution, indoor air quality, occupational safety and public health, industrial and medical application, and nuclear safety, etc. ASTA is a member of International Aerosol Research Assembly, IARA, and also a member of Asian Aerosol Research Association, AARA. About more than a year back, we started this monthly lecture series, wherein every month we organize an online lecture for about 45 to 50 minutes by eminent researchers working in various fields of aerosol research, as Dr. Christof joined us today, in science or engineering or medicine or industry. The lectures are followed by an interactive question answer session where one can directly interact with the speaker. Today's speaker is Dr. Christof Asbach. Now I request my friend Dr. Manish Joshi to kindly introduce the speaker. Manish, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Christof Asbach received his PhD degree from University of Duisburg, Essen, Germany in 2004 for the development of a technology for time-resolved, artifact-free measurement of atmospheric particulate matter. During his 2-year postdoctoral stay at the University of Minnesota, he worked on the prevention of particulate contamination in extreme ultraviolet lithography systems. Then in 2006, he joined the Institute of Environment and Energy, Technology and Analytics in Duisburg, where he became head of the department, which is named as Filtration and Aerosol Research in 2013. Since 2022, he is honorary professor at the Faculty of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Duisburg, Essen. Dr. Christof's research work encompasses a wide variety covering aerosol instrumentation, nanoparticles, filtration, and exposure assessment. His work on intercomparison has resulted in terms of defined protocols for accurate aerosol measurements. He has immensely contributed towards development of techniques and devices, to name a few: thermophoretic sampler, electrode filters, aerosol mitigators, etc. His pioneer work has been published in the form of 110 peer-reviewed papers so far. He is also an editor of scientific journals at Aerosol Research and Aerosol and Air Quality Research. From 2020 until 2024, he was also president of a similar organization in Germany. And this is a very nice time to see him to deliver a lecture for IASTA, which is also a sister organization for the same cause from India. With this introduction, it is my privilege to request Dr. Asbach to kindly deliver his exciting talk.
Well, thank you both for the very kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm trying my best to share the screen now. Okay. So here we go. Yes, thank you very much also for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about something that we've been working here at the Institute Utah for about 10 years already. And that's the use of low-cost PM sensors for very different applications. It's a topic that has raised a lot of interest over the last 10 years, an increasing interest. And I've seen a lot of presentations on this where I had the impression that people maybe expect too much from the low-cost sensors, whereas I see the application of these low-cost sensors actually much less in, say, compliance measurements, but a lot more in different applications where you can use them to establish dense networks, for example, to keep track of spatiotemporal distribution of particles, whether it's in the atmosphere or in indoor environments. So I've outline my talk as follows. I will first, since I don't know if everyone's fully familiar with how these low-cost sensors work, I will first give an introduction into the measurement principle of these low-cost sensors, and then show you some results that we obtained in laboratory evaluations. You will see that we did that for monodisperse as well as polydisperse particles. I will then show some results for ambient PM measurements that we conducted here in Duisburg. And especially, I will go into a bit more detail on the effect of relative humidity, because that's a very well-known and often reported cross-sensitivity for these measurements. And I will show you some results for a low-cost aerosol dryer that we developed. And I will then move on to more indoor applications, especially in industrial environments, whether it's for exposure assessment, or in a specific case that we did recently on the control of HVAC systems in industrial environments on demand. And a final case study that I will show you is something that we did for the German military, and that's how we can use low-cost sensors to evaluate protective clothing. And then I'll finally summarize and conclude. I already mentioned that these low-cost sensors have become very popular over the recent years. And when I talk about low-cost sensors, I should mention that I do not talk about full devices, but just the sensor modules that you can buy off the shelf, but it's not a full device, so it doesn't have a display. You still need to connect it to a computer or Raspberry Pi or something to collect the data. The prices for these sensor modules is in a range of a few euros to a few €100. And as mentioned, due to the low costs and also the small size, you can use them to set up dense sensor networks, which can also give you some information on when and where, for example, concentrations may go up. But there are multiple applications, and we've seen here in Europe, but I've seen also in the US, and I'm sure there is something similar in Asia and in India, in citizen science applications. But in particular, we're actually more interested in indoor and workplace applications of these low-cost sensors. However, given the small size and the low costs of these devices, they have scientific counterparts, and these scientific counterparts are by a factor of a few hundred to a few thousand more expensive than these low cost sensors. It's obvious that there are several limitations that apply. This considered the size range of particles that's covered by these sensors. It considers the concentration range, the particle material that has an effect, cross sensitivities, I already mentioned the humidity, durability of the sensors, etc. Now, how do these devices work? There are different categories. The simplest category of these sensors, I should mention beforehand that all these low-cost sensors are actually based on light scattering. So they detect light, the intensity of light that's scattered by particles. In the simplest version, the so-called photometer, you have a measurement volume, which is relatively large. You have an aerosol flow through that volume, and this volume gets illuminated by a light source and a focusing lens. And then the particles, multiple particles inside this measurement volume, scatter light, and under a certain angle, typically 90 degrees, the light is detected and amplified, and then eventually, so this detector and amplifier deliver a voltage, and this voltage is a measure for the total particle concentration, to keep it simple at this point. The intensity of the light, however, not only depends on the particle number or volume of the particles inside the measurement volume, it also depends on the size of the particles. That means eventually the particle size distribution. It depends on the wavelength, which of course is given for a given light source, but it also depends on the refractive index of the particles. Just as a simple example, if you have a black and a white particle of the same size, the white particle will scatter more light than the black particle, and that's simply because of the refractive index. Now, as a result of such a measurement, you see here, it's the voltage that's measured here downstream of the amplifier. As a function of time, you see some fluctuation, and that actually is supposed to reflect the concentration of the particles. However, as mentioned in the last slide, it's not only the concentration of the particles, it's also depending on the particle size and the particle refractive index. And based on that, you get some information on the concentration, but it's actually not fully sufficient to determine the mass concentration, because you need to make assumptions on the particle size distribution as well as the refractive index. And if you want to determine a mass concentration, like a PMX for concentration, you also need to assume a density of the particles. Eventually, for the calibration, you have to assume all these, and you have to assume all these factors to be constant. Then you can simply derive a calibration factor K and multiply the voltage with it, and then you get the time series of the particulate mass concentration. So to summarize the photometers, they're very simple and very cheap devices. And in fact, some of these low-cost photometers cost just a few euros. But the calibration is based on several, I would rather say many assumptions, and it can only be accurate if these assumptions are met. On the other end of the spectrum of the different sensor working principles is the spectrometer. In fact, this is also a very common device of scientific grade instruments where you have single particle counters or single particle spectrometers. So you have a very small measurement volume here, and the particles are transported through this measurement volume in such a way that ideally, at most, a single particle is present inside the measurement volume. And you have a light source that illuminates this volume, and each individual particle now causes a light scattering peak. And these peaks are counted as a measure for the particle number, and the height of the peaks is measured as a measure for the particle size. But again, it depends. So the intensity of the light scattered depends on the one hand on the size. This is what we want because we may get the size information, but also on the refractive index. So again, that's something that has to be assumed. And then some instrument parameters like the wavelength of the light, the intensity of the incoming light, the detection angle, and the aperture angle. Now, as a result, the measurement result here, the voltage as a function of time, looks like we can see here. So each individual spike now reflects a single particle. And as mentioned, the height of the particle is a measure of the particle size, but not only, it's also a measure of the particle refractive index. But then you can count the individual peaks, and thereby you get a measure for the particle number, or if you know the flow rate, the number concentration. And so based on such a measurement, the primary output is a particle number size concentration, like the one that we see here in the black curve. And the particle diameter now is something that's called an optical equivalent particle diameter. That means that particles of this particular size here, for example, if we're at 0.3 microns, it means that the measured particle scatters the same intensity of light as a particle used for the calibration, like polystyrene latex particle of this particular size. So this gives you the number size distribution. And then by assuming that these particles are spherical, you can determine the volume size distribution. And then by assuming a density, you also get the mass size distribution. This is what's printed in red here as an example. And then you can integrate over the size ranges of interest, like up to 2.5 micrometers for PM2.5 or up to 10 micron for PM10. And thereby you get time-resolved information on both the size distribution as well as the different PMX fractions that can be calculated from it. So spectrometers are more complex and also more expensive than photometers. And in fact, the available photometers that give you size distributions cost in a range of 250 to 500 euros. But they're designed to measure individual particles. And so you can measure the size distributions and then calculate the different PMX fractions. And since you already get size information directly out of the devices, you need less assumptions and therefore can be more accurate than with a photometer. In fact, the most commonly used devices these days are something that in this technical specification of the European Standardization Organization, and that TS actually came out very recently. And I've been basically writing this CEN-TS. In this CEN-TS, we call it an advanced photometer. The setup is basically very similar to the one of a spectrometer, but with one difference, and that is the volume, the measurement volume is a bit larger. That is, now you no longer only measure single particles, but you don't measure as many particles as with a photometer, but still it's like a cloud of particles that's scattering the light. And what is measured now is, on the one hand, a photometric signal that's kind of an offset. And the photometric signal stems from the very large number of small particles which are present. And if you look at typical size distributions, then you typically have a lot of small particles and a few large particles. And the few large particles of different sizes actually are mostly responsible for the mass concentrations, whereas the large number of small particles only gives kind of the baseline of the mass concentration. And that's what this exploits. So it measures the photometric signal, which stems from the large number of small particles. But then you have individual larger particles, a low number of individual larger particles. They cause much higher light scattering pulses. And these pulses then actually stick out of the photometric signal, and these spikes can then be counted, and the intensity can be measured as a measure for the presence of larger particles, and also the size can be estimated based on the height. And based on this, they can differentiate between different size fractions in terms of the mass concentration. And some also give different values or different fractions of the number concentration. So in the following, I will show you results for a selection of sensors. So on the one hand, we have one spectrometer here. That's the AlphaSense OPC R3. You see it costs around 250 euros. It measures number size distribution in 16 size bins. And like for all these devices, the manufacturers say they start measuring at 0.3 microns. And as an aerosol scientist and is mainly involved in instrumentation, I always interpret the lower detection limit as a D50. That is the size where 50% of the particles are detected and 50% are not detected. So I put D50 down here of 0.3 microns. We will see in a bit that this is kind of a misunderstanding on my side, or maybe the manufacturer's side, I don't know, on what the lower size end actually means. So this gives size distribution in 16 size bins and PM1, PM2.5, and PM10 mass concentrations. All the other sensors that we tested are advanced photometers, and we see that all but one deliver number concentrations in different fractions, from 3 fractions up to 6 different size fractions. And all but one other sensor deliver mass concentrations in between 2 and 4 fractions. So every one of the sensors delivers PM2.5 and PM10. Some also deliver PM1. And one of the sensors, this is Sensirion, also gives PM4, which is a value that's typically used in occupational exposure studies. So we took these to our lab and investigated the size-dependent detection efficiency of these sensors. So what we did is we first generated a polydisperse aerosol from a powder. So it's 2 different powders we used, titania and fumed silica, because we know they have very different refractive indices. And then we first classified them based on the aerodynamic diameter using an aerodynamic aerosol classifier. It's a combustion device. So you can set the settings of the device such that only particles of one very narrow range of aerodynamic diameters leaves the device. These monodispersed particles were fed into a float channel. And I should mention, with the ASC, we can select sizes between 25 nanometers and 5 micrometers aerodynamic diameter. So we fed them into a float channel where a number of these sensors was sitting. And then we measured with reference devices, on the one hand, a high scientific grade optical particle counter. It's a Pallas Fidas, which is type approved for different PMX fractions for the atmosphere, and also delivers size distributions. And we used a scanning mobility particle sizer, which measures the size distributions based on the electrical mobility diameter. And now, why did we choose this particular setup? On the one hand, the AAC has the great advantage that it delivers truly monodispersed particles, so it doesn't rely on charges like the a DMA would. But on the other hand, with the combination of an aerodynamic diameter classified by the AAC and the measurement of the mobility diameter, we get information on the effective particle density, which is what we need. It's the density that we need to determine the mass of the particles, which are non-spherical. That's why it's effective density. So it's to determine the mass of the particles and thereby also the mass concentration of the particles. In another experiment, we used a single Lamer generator to produce monodispersed DHS particles. So a single Lamer generator is a generator where you first produce sodium chloride seed particles, very small ones of like few dozens of nanometers, and then you expose them to a saturated or supersaturated atmosphere of DHS vapor. DHS is an oily substance very commonly used, for example, in filtration research. So while exposing it to the supersaturated atmosphere, the vapor condenses onto the particles and thereby forms droplets. And the nice thing about condensation is that if you do it right, the resulting particle size is monodisperse. And the size of these monodispersed particles can be controlled by the number concentration of the seed particles and the saturation level of the DHS, which both we have under control. Now, looking at the results, this now is the result for the counting efficiency for those sensors that determine a number concentration. And what you normally would expect here is the typical S-shaped curve. So it's the counting efficiency is 0, and then it starts to increase, and then there's a D50, which I assume to be 0.3 microns, because that's what the manufacturers deliver as the lower detection efficiency. So at 0.3 microns, we would expect to see 50% detection efficiency, and then it further increases to a detection efficiency of 1, and then reaches a plateau and remains at 1. In fact, the only device that has a detection efficiency that's somewhat similar to what we would expect is the AlphaSense spectrometer, although it overshoots here a bit, but you see it starts to increase and then it remains at a certain detection efficiency, but only for DHS, whereas for titania, we see that it's even increasing further. And for fumed silica, it's actually very low, but that's kind of expected because we know that fumed silica is just poorly detected by optical measurement devices. Now, looking at the other sensors, we see that the behavior is different. Again, only the Sensirion has a similar shape to what one would expect, but has a maximum efficiency of 200%, so the counting efficiency of 2 for DHS. Whereas for titania, it also keeps on increasing, and that's in fact the case for all the devices. And that's a bit strange, and we never really understood it, but it must have to do with the internal algorithm that's probably not really suitable for monodispersed particles. And we also see now looking here at the plant tower device, for example, you see that it even reaches values of 50. That means detection efficiency of 5,000%. Which is also not very meaningful. So number concentrations, that's something we learned from these measurements. Number concentrations delivered by these devices need to be treated with care. Now, looking at the mass concentration detection efficiency, that's now here plotted for the PM10 detection efficiency. Again, we see the AlphaSense shows something similar to what we would expect for DHS and reaches, again, efficiencies larger than 1, but it's kind of increasing and then reaches somewhat a plateau. For DHS, again, it looks different and a bit strange. For the other devices, we typically see, you see, it goes up already at relatively small particle sizes, and then it reaches a maximum, which is often higher than 1, so more than 100%, and then it starts to decrease again. Like, for example, if we look here at the Sensorion device, you see it increases, reaches the maximum at about 0.5 microns, and then it decreases, and above 5 micrometers, it's pretty much blind to it. The same applies to the plant tower, which also already at smaller particles starts to be almost blind to these particles. So again, this shows all these sensors do something internally that we don't really understand, because it has to do with the internal algorithm, what is actually reported by the devices, and these are completely undisclosed. But something we can clearly see is that for large particles, way in the micron size, these sensors are blind and they cannot really report these large particles. So let's take a look what they do for polydisperse aerosols. And in fact, this was a pre-normative research project for developing this technical specifications that I mentioned a bit earlier that came out recently. So all the project partners came together at a facility of TNO in the Netherlands. We had in total around 85 sensors inside a measurement chamber, which we can see up here in the photograph and also down here in the schematic. So what we do is we have a flow channel. We introduce the aerosol into the flow channel, make sure it's homogeneously mixed inside the chamber, and so that all the sensors see the same aerosol. And then we had a number of reference devices also sampling from the chamber. And we had a filter sampler that delivered then gravimetric reference values for the mass concentrations, which is something that you need because, as mentioned earlier, the sensors measure light scattering and they don't measure the mass. So you need to calibrate them for the specific test aerosol that you're working with, or the aerosol in the location that you work with. And the manufacturer calibration is typically done for typical atmospheric particles. And depending on where you are in workplaces or indoor environments, these may be completely off. And we also had a chance, and it's not plotted in the schematic here, but to control the flow rate of the freshly generated aerosol into this main flow here, and thereby we could generate concentration ramps up and down. This is an example for the titanium dioxide particles. It's P25 from Evonik that we used. So on the left-hand side, you can see the size distribution measured with the FIDAS frog, which is also kind of a reference instrument that delivers size distributions and PMX concentrations. So it's the number size distribution. The fact that it decreases here at the lower end is that the counting efficiency of the FIDAS frog for these small particles goes down. In fact, the true particle number size distribution would continue towards smaller particles and have a modal diameter maybe around 0.1 microns. On the right-hand side, we can now see the number concentrations as a function of time for 3 phases, so 3 ramps up and down. In green, that's the data for the FIDAS frog, and in black for a condensation particle counter that we used, as both were used as reference instruments. So now you can see the FIDAS frog number concentration is always lower than the CPC concentration. That's simply because of the different size ranges. The CPC started measuring at 2.5 nanometers, whereas the FIDAS frog starts at 180 nanometers. But there's something else that you can clearly see, and that is the concentration reported by the frog, the FIDAS frog, is much smoother than the concentration delivered by the CPC. And in fact, with the CPC concentrations, you can see these individual spikes. And by the way, I forgot to ask if you can see my my cursor. I now changed to the laser pointer. I hope that you're able to see it. So here we can see there's a spike in the concentration, for example, another spike we can see here. And we believe, and that will be important in one of the next slides, we believe that these spikes come from bursts of very small particles into the measurement system. We don't really know where they came from, but since they're very small, the CPC can detect them and the FIDAS frog cannot. And before showing you the results, I would just like to mention that out of all the different sensor types that we tested here, we previously aged, or I should better say fouled, 2 of the sensors per sensor type, because we wanted to know what happens if these sensors had been exposed to large concentrations of particles. So we again generated titanium dioxide particles with a brush generator, fed that into a flow channel, kept track of the particle concentration here. And so we operated them for about 2 full days, 48.3 hours, at an average mass concentration of 22 milligrams per cubic meter. So in Europe, we have a PM10 limit value, a daily PM10 limit value of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. So that would correspond to approximately 2.5 years operation at the European limit value for ambient PM10 values. And in fact, if we now take a look at this photograph of the sensors after this fouling experiments, you can see all the dust deposits here on the sensors. So we actually tortured them quite a bit with lots of dust. Now, looking at the results that came out here. So what's plotted here now is the number concentration of the reported by the sensors over the number concentration plotted by reported by the feeder's frog as a reference device. For the different sensors, and open symbols refer to the aged sensors, closed symbols to fresh sensors. And now there are several things that can be seen here. First thing is if you use different sensor models, so each color represents one sensor model. If you use different sensor model, each model will deliver a different concentration value. However, if you use multiple sensors of the same model, so multiple specimens of the same model, they agree fairly well with each other. That's important if you want to keep track of spatiotemporal distribution of concentrations, because if you use multiple sensors in a network, you want to make sure that if the concentration, say, in one corner of your facility goes up at a certain time, you want to make sure that it's because of the aerosol, because of the particle concentration, and not because of the differences in the sensors. So that's a good sign. However, as you see, the results from the different sensor models can be very different. But something else that can be seen is the response is very linear. And I should mention that the response is very linear. And that means you can relatively easily recalibrate the sensors because it's just a linear response, as I will show in the next slide. But before that, I would also like to show you the scatter plots of the number concentrations delivered by the sensors. So these are the exact same data as shown in the left graph, but now against the number concentrations measured with a condensation particle counter. And now you can see that there's a lot more scatter in the data because the counter, the CPC has a much wider size range than the sensors. So, and you can see that the curves actually get flat for higher concentrations. And we believe that these values that we see here actually stem from these spikes that I've shown you in the time series of the concentrations. And that's why we also believe that these spikes stem from very small particles because they're recorded by the condensation particle counter, but they are not measured by the sensor. And that's why the curves here get horizontal. That means with these sensors, you can only detect larger particles in a range at least larger than 0.18 micron, as shown by the feeder's frog, but probably rather really in a range larger than about 0.3 microns, as reported also by the manufacturers. For smaller particles, for nanoparticles, these sensors are simply not usable because the small particles scatter way too little light. Now, going back to the response of the individual sensors, and to make the representation a bit clearer, I now focus on just 5 sensor specimens per sensor model. Now, what you can see is that except for one of the Sensirion sensors, the response of the aged sensors is pretty much identical with the sensors, with the new sensors. That means aging in most cases doesn't really play a role. And again, the response is very linear. So now what you can do is just do this linear fit equation to each of the results for each sensor model. That's done here. And you can see from the slope of the fits from about 0.15 to 3, it's a range of factor of 20 between the different sensors. That's the deviation of the sensors to each other. But look at the correlation coefficient, R square. So under the conditions that we had here, perfect lag conditions, the correlation factor is larger than 0.99. So it's really, really well correlated. And now you can use these correlation equations as a calibration correction function. And if you do that, and now look at the right graph, then you can see, okay, the number concentration agrees fairly well with the number concentration of the feeder's frog after this adjustment of the calibration. And the thin dotted lines that you see here on the right side are actually the plus minus 30% range. You can see that most of the data are actually within plus minus 30% to the reference. The same can be done for the mass concentrations. And again, now I don't really want to go too much into detail, but we've done the same thing for PM1, PM2.5, and PM10. What's interesting to note is that the sequence of the curves changes. So here in the left case, we had the next PM sensors delivering the highest PM1 concentrations, followed by Sensirion, followed by Plantower, and then the alpha sense. Now, if we go to the very right corner, sorry, oh yeah, no, the smallest one was the Plantower. If you look at the right-hand side, then we see that the alpha sense delivers the best results. It's almost 1-to-1. Then followed by the next PM sensors. Then it's the Nova Fitness, which doesn't deliver PM1. And then again, the lowest is the Plantower. So it's even not consistent among the different PM fractions. But again, the response is very linear. And again, we can see that except for the one Sensirion device, the aging of the sensors didn't really have much of an influence on the sensor response. So we could also do the same kind of corrections as shown you in the previous slide. And what we can now clearly see is that with this correction, the values are best for, or the agreement is best for PM1 here in the lower left graph, followed by PM2.5, and then you have much more scatter for the PM10. And we believe this has a lot to do with what we've seen for the monodispersed particles, that simply the sensors, most of the sensors are pretty much blind for particles larger than a few micrometers. Okay, let's leave the lab and go to field application of these sensors. So this is a map of Central Europe. And by the way, I'm currently sitting, in case you're interested, somewhere around here where the cursor is at the moment, so very close to Düsseldorf. And if you look at this map, it's actually from earlier this year. You may think that here in the Netherlands and Belgium, they've had very high PM10 concentrations in this case. But then now looking at the weather radar for the exact same time, you see that, I mean, the wind direction is here typically mostly from the west, west to northwest. And you see there's been rain going through this area, and the humidity was very high during this time. And in fact, what happens if you have high humidity, some particles, hygroscopic particles like sodium chloride or ammonium nitrate particles, for example, they will grow. They will take up water and they grow, even if the vapor phase is not saturated. And the strange thing about this hygroscopic growth is that it's also not linear. So at low humidity, nothing happens. And then if the humidity increases, nothing happens until you reach a certain point. That's called the deliquescence point. At about 75% relative humidity, in this case for sodium chloride, it's different for each material. And then it suddenly takes up water and grows, and then it keeps on growing. So what's shown here is actually the mass of a droplet, and you can see it can easily reach a factor of 10 or higher masses compared to the dry mass of the particles. And now when the humidity decreases, the particle retains the water down to lower humidity levels until you reach something that's called efflorescence point, and then it drops down to the original dry state and the dry size of the particles. Now, what we're interested in is actually, because that's what triggers the effects, at least the health effects, are the dry sizes of the particles. However, if you have higher humidity levels, then the sensor will detect the larger particles and will interpret the particle mass as the dry mass, whereas we're interested in the wet particle mass, whereas we're interested in the dry mass. That means we're getting too high mass concentrations compared to what we're interested in. This is just a quotation from a citation from a paper that shows that it's not just theory, but really practice. Now, I've seen a number of studies that try to develop correction factors for the hygroscopic growth effect, so the or the humidity effect on the sensors, and some of them work okay, but I mean, you see, there's no linear relationship. So a very simple correction is, in my understanding, not really possible unless you allow larger uncertainties. And instead, our idea was, why not look at developing a low-cost aerosol dryer? In fact, that's what the scientific grade instruments and like the FIDAs, for example, also do. They use a dryer, in their case, not a low-cost dryer, but a much more expensive dryer. And these dryers cost something like a few €1,000. And of course, you don't want to use a dryer for a few €1,000 to operate a €50 sensor. And instead, what we did, and was a master thesis of one of my students, he just used a copper tube, put some heating tape around it. It's actually self-regulating heating tape that heats the temperature inside the dryer to about 25, 30 degrees Celsius above ambient temperature. Thereby, the vapor, the water vapor from the particles evaporates, and the aerosol is still warm when it reaches the sensor, the sensing volume of the sensor, and so it has not recondensed, or not, the particles have not taken up the water again, and thereby we measure a dry aerosol with our sensors. Just to give you a brief idea of what it looks like if you measure without a dryer and with a dryer. So in parallel, these are actually measurements that were conducted on the parking lot of our institute. It's the PM10 ratio measured with one of these sensor types that I've shown you, divided by the reference concentration delivered by a TEOM that was measuring alongside. And you can see that for low humidity levels, actually the ratio is below 1. So the sensors underestimate the particle mass concentrations. Then you can see the clear dependence on the humidity. And then at high humidity levels, you can see we get up to a factor of 10 too high mass concentrations. So it's a logarithmic scale that we see here. Now, so we had two sensors without dryer and two identical sensors running in parallel with dryer. And this is what you can see on the right-hand side. So with the dryer, there still is a moderate dependence on the relative humidity, but it's very much reduced. But now we can also see these ratios are typically almost all below 1, which means we're underestimating the particle mass concentrations. But again, it's a very linear response, as shown in the previous graphs from the lab experiments, so we could correct for them. And if we do that, so what's shown here is actually hourly data. If we do that for 24-hour data measured here, then we can see on the left-hand side with the dryer, we actually do see a fairly good correlation of the results from the sensor with the PM10 concentration. In this case, actually measured with a low volume sampler, the PM10 concentration. So that's the pure gravimetric reference, and the agreement is quite okay. And also looking here at the time series. So in black, it's the TEOM. In blue, it's the sensor without dryer. And red, it's the sensor with dryer. And the symbols are the filter data. Then we can see that the sensor with dryer agrees quite well with the data from the filter sampler. Again, do not expect too much. It's not sufficient for compliance measurements, but if you want to get a good estimate of what's in the air, then these sensors can very well be used. Okay, but I mentioned also in the beginning that we're actually currently a bit more interested in looking at what's happening indoors, because there, especially the humidity effect is typically not that much of an issue, because you have lower humidity level indoors than outdoors, especially not the high peaks. But concentrations can be, especially if you look in industrial environments, can be much higher than outdoors. But the other thing that's a downside, whereas for outdoors, the sensors are already calibrated for the ambient measurements, although it may not be fully sufficient, as we've seen. But for indoors, they're definitely not calibrated, so they need to be recalibrated. And one of the measurement campaigns that we had earlier this year, about half a year ago, was in a welding facility. So there, what we had is, on the one hand, we used two different sensor models, three sensors of each of the models. One is the Sensirion SPS30 we've seen previously in the lab experiments already. And then there's another Sensirion sensor called Sen55. That's a relatively new development that also includes a NOx sensor. Then we had a filter sampler and a filter changer. So for 14 days, we had a daily filter change. And in this case, we measured PM2.5 because we found that PM2.5 actually matches better the results of the sensors than PM10. And then we also had an optical aerosol spectrometer, in this case, a GRIM 11D, running in parallel as a time-resolved quasi-reference. Now, just looking at the filters from the filter sample, you can already, just from looking at the color of the filters, see on which days the welding facility was actually active, whether people were working, and whereas on the working days, we can see this brownish reddish color, whereas on the weekends, the filters are white with a slight gray shade because no work was actually going on. And the intention, I should have mentioned that in the last slide, the intention of these measurements is to eventually use the sensors to control the ventilation system on demand. So if there's a high concentration, then it would be the ventilation flow would be increased, and if there's low concentration, would be decreased. Now, looking at the sheer values of the mass concentrations in the workplace, we see that they are still relatively low compared with the limit value for workplaces, which is above 1 milligram, whereas here the highest concentrations were even below 60 micrograms per cubic meter. And just comparing the daily averages measured with the sensors, so these are the blue and green symbols, measured with the GRIM 11D quasi-reference device, and the filter data. These are uncorrected data, so as delivered by the devices. And you can see, again, two things. Just looking at the weekend data here, you can see for the weekends, the results actually agree very well. The results from the filter, the GRIM, and the different Sensirion sensors. And this is simply because all these devices have been calibrated for atmospheric aerosol. And during the weekends, there was no work going on in the facility, and therefore we mainly had atmospheric aerosol in the facility. But during work days, you see that the difference is much larger, and the sensors are actually underestimating the mass concentrations present in the facility. And this has two reasons. The one thing is you can tell from the color of the filters that the refractive indices of the particles are different. But since it's a welding facility during working days, there's probably a lot of metal in the air, and metals have a much higher density than the typical atmospheric particles, and therefore the assumed density during the calibration is also too low. Now, if we do the same kind of correction that I've shown you for the laboratory experiments and apply them to the sensors as well as the 11D, then we see that the agreement is okay. It's not perfect, but it's okay. You see, it's worst actually during the weekends, where it can be easily a factor of 2 off, because there we should not have corrected the data, but we just applied the same correction function to all the data that we have received. But on the other days, the actual mismatch is not that big. And now, considering that for controlling ventilation systems, you don't really need the highest accuracy possible, but a good estimate of the concentration in the workplace is actually sufficient for that control. So this is for the daily averages. If we just look at the 1 minute data, delivered by the sensors as well as the 11D. There are a few outliers where we don't really know what happened. If we neglect the outliers, these are the right graphs, then you see that there's actually always a quite good agreement between the Sensorion sensor data of both different models and the GRIM 11D, which costs like a factor of, I don't know, 200 more than the sensors. And also looking at the correlation coefficients here, we see that they're, even for 1 minute data, all larger than 0.95. So also if you use the sensors not in the same location, but in different locations, you can get a very good estimate of how particles would disperse or where particles may be emitted, so you can locate sources in your facility with that. And our final example, a final case study that we've done is actually, as mentioned, something that we did for the German military, where they are interested in testing protective clothing against aerosol phase airborne, so particulate airborne combat materials. The most well-known is probably anthrax, but there are other materials as well, which are applied in particle form. And these protective clothing shall protect against these airborne particles. And at the military research facility, they actually have a wind tunnel. And in this wind tunnel, a mannequin can be placed, like it can be seen here. The mannequin can be equipped with the protective clothing. And you see all this apparatus back here. It can actually be moving. So we can actually simulate a walking soldier wearing the protective clothing in the wind tunnel. And if you undress the mannequin, then you can see all these black dots here on the, let's call it, skin of the mannequin. Each black dot actually means that we drilled a hole into the mannequin. It's hollow from inside. And behind each of the holes sits one of these low-cost spectrometers. And during the testing, we actually produced monodispersed DHS particles with a size of approximately 1 micron, which according to our military contracts is the most relevant particle size. Since we used a spectrometer which could keep track of or could differentiate between these 1 micrometer monodispersed particles and any background particles, which may still be there. And so we measured, on the one hand, here the concentration in the wind tunnel with the low-cost sensor. We call that the raw gas concentration. And we measured at a number of, I think, 32 different locations across the body of the mannequin. That's what we call the clean gas concentration. And by that, we defined a protection factor, which is simply the ratio of the raw gas to the clean gas concentration. So ideally, we would always have an infinite protection factor. That means the clean gas concentration is 0. But in reality, it's never really 0, but it can only be close to 0. This is one example. In fact, it's an example that's good for demonstration, but not good for a good protective clothing. It's actually a 2-piece suit. You see it has a jacket and trousers. It's designed as an overgarment. And you can clearly see that at the transition here from the jacket to the trousers, this is where already after 20 seconds, the intrusion of the particle starts, and it starts to distribute across the body. And then after some time, you can see after 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, it even starts to distribute all over the body, downstream of, also down, below the overgarment. And in fact, I should probably also mention we tested a bunch of other garments as well, and there were others that were much better with nearly 0 protection factor, in infinite protection factor, 0 clean gas concentrations, but some of them also showed a rather poor performance. So with that, I would like to summarize and conclude. I've shown you that there's a large variety of these low-cost sensors, and I could only show you results for a small selection of them. There are many more of them. Due to the low costs, you can actually afford also setting up dense networks and get unprecedented high spatio-temporal resolution. The range of applications is very wide, and I personally see a lot more applications in indoor and industrial environments compared to ambient, although they're also valuable there. But of course, the downside is that you have a reduced accuracy and reduced wealth of information, and there are some cross sensitivities. But if you don't expect too much from them, that means you don't expect too high or too low measurement uncertainties, then you can actually make a lot of use in using them, for example, in indoor and workplace measurements for detecting leaks, or as I've shown, also for protective clothing. With that, I would like to acknowledge the contributions of many of my colleagues from different partner institutions in the various projects, as well as the different sponsors of this work. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Christof. That was really very interesting and very informative talk. I'm sure there will be many questions. And to handle the question answer session, I would request my friend, Dr. Manoranjan Sahu, to please take care. Dr. Sahu?
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please continue.
Okay, Dr. Christof, thank you so much for an exciting talk on low-cost sensor. And in India, a lot of attention now on low-cost sensor, considering you understand that there's a lot of polluted cities in India. But however, the concentration in India are very high compared to Europe. These are some of the interesting things to understand. Probably from Indian context, we'd like to understand a little bit how this sensor can be utilized to identify the things. So it's a very exciting talk. You talk about laboratory calibration as well as the ambient calibration. It's very exciting. But in the literature, it has mentioned that some of the sensor, the performance can vary from 200 to even 700 percentage, right? The accuracy level, and that depends on variety of parameters,
Yeah.
right? Starting from relative humidity, chemical composition, and as you said, what is that called? Mu parameter, that refractive index, and all this. So very exciting talk, very informative. Thank you so much for your time for delivering such talk. I would like to open for our audience to ask few questions. So please raise your hand if anyone would like to ask question. There is a raising hand option somewhere.
I see there are some questions in the chat.
Okay.
And I see actually two questions or comments are actually as a direct question to me. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to read them out and answer them here.
Yes, you can. You
Okay.
can. If you are able to read, I think that would be great.
Yeah. So the question here posed by Deepak. Hi, we have a question. The satellite image you were showing were the year on data used to check the data of low-cost sensors. Also, the satellite data correlate with that during the whole year. Was that checked? I'm actually not really sure
Yeah.
if that probably refers to the graph that I've shown. Let's see if I can go
I think
back.
the question is not very clear also.
It's probably also a misunderstanding, and I forgot to mention there was one. Okay. Here, it's probably this one. In fact, this is not a satellite image. It's this is citizen science project. And each of these spots that we see here represents at least one sensor that's located within that spot. And the color represents the concentration that's measured there. But it's actually low-cost sensors which are operated by private individuals. And they upload the data to a cloud, and then it's displayed here as a map all over Europe. I forgot to mention that. And everything that so all the limitations that I mentioned apply to these measurements, especially the humidity. And this is why I showed this map here on the lower right corner, which is the weather radar, which shows that there has been rain going through and the humidity was high. I hope this answers the question.
So the next question is, can we use this low-cost sensor in high altitude regions, approximately 4 kilometer, say, example?
I haven't done this research myself, but I know there's research done by the Cyprus Institute by George Biskos, because he uses low-cost sensors and other small miniaturized instrumentation on drones. I don't think he has tested for pressure levels that mimic 4,000 meters per above sea level, but I know that he's gone to relatively low pressures and he did not see any influence on the measurement results. So I believe it should work, but it's currently just an assumption and I don't have any scientific proof for that.
So the next question is from Mohammad Jayed. Sensors are designed for a standard flow rate. Will installation of external dryer affect the sensor flow rate and performance? How you account it in your study?
Okay, that's a good question because flow rate for these sensors is always an issue because it cannot really easily be checked because they only use this. They don't really use a pump, but they use these computer fans to draw the air through it. And we know that they cannot overcome any major pressure drop. This is why, for example, Nafion dryers would not work. You know, Nafion dryers where you have these membrane dryers and you need to pull the air through a relatively thin tube that's made of this membrane because the pressure drop is too high. In our case, we try to, and I'm a bit careful with measure the results of these flow rate measurements. We try to measure them with a bubble meter, and we measure it with and without the dryer. And as you've probably seen, the dryer. I can go to the next slide because then you can see it. The dryer is actually a relatively thick copper tube, so the pressure drop is extremely small. And we measured it and we didn't see any difference. So with this design, it works. Apparently it works, and we've been operating this now for more than 2 years. The results I've shown was just for maybe half a year, but it's been operating for more than 2 years and it still works okay.
Okay, so the next question is someone has asked, in your 1 minute data graph, how were outliers identified? Was there any statistical approach used?
No, it's actually a very, very simple approach if I go there. And I mean, I saw that the time was almost up. That's why I quickly moved over it. But you see, there are some values here where the concentration is overestimated by factors of 50 to 100. So we just said everything that's way above the correct value, we just identified them as outliers. But there was no statistical approach actually in this sense.
So
And I
one of
should
the
mention,
important,
and I should mention the measurement with the 11D and the sensors. It was close to each other, but it was not directly adjacent, and it was at a different height. That had to do. I mean, ideally we would have measured right next to each other, but then we would have had to place the Grim 11D at a location where everyone would have had access to it. And you know, it's a welding workshop, and you don't really know what the people would have done to the device. So as a compromise, we placed it at a safe place, and it was a little bit like 2 meters away, but also at a different height than the sensors. And that's why what we think was the reason for these outliers.
okay. So the one question is, so this
I
local
think,
sensor,
Dr. Sahu, I think Pratima has raised hand. If she want to ask directly, she can
okay,
ask.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Pratima, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sahu sir and Rastogi sir. Hello, Christof. So that was a very interesting presentation, and the results were also very impressive. I have a very common question that we have been struggling to find an answer to since last couple of years. That we know that these sensors are quite sensitive, and they vary according to the geographical locations as well. The calibration and the co-location methodologies. So we have seen instances where citizen groups, they have the ability to buy these instrument and use as per their convenience if they want to measure tailpipe emissions or near source emissions, and then compare it with regulatory monitoring data. So without the knowledge of calibration and co-location, it becomes very difficult to compare what is coming out of these low-cost sensors. However, I would want to understand that at national level or international level, do we have a platform which can approve or certify sensors and say that these are the few top sensors that can be used in so and so geographical locations? If that's the condition, it becomes easy for each and every continent or country to understand that we should be using so and so for PM or gaseous particles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very, very good question. The thing is, I'm not aware of any kind of database where you can look up appropriate sensors for certain applications. I think the only thing that can be done is looking up scientific publications where they have been applied to different kinds of applications. When it comes to choosing the right sensor, there is, I mean, for indoor applications, workplace applications, there's this technical specification from CEN that I mentioned that actually describes how sensors can be selected and how they can be calibrated for the different applications. For atmospheric applications, I know I'm not sure if it's published already, but there's something in preparation, also a technical specification on CEN level. So CEN is the European Standardization Organization. I'm not sure if that's published yet, and I haven't read it, so I don't really know if they give any guidance on how to select the sensors. Something that should be mentioned at this point, and I mean, we've seen the differences also between the sensors and the GRIM 11D compared to the filter data, as well as the FIDAS and FIDAS Frog to the filter data. The general limitations that I mentioned, dependence on refractive index and dependence on the density, apply to any optical measurement device. So the uncertainties of the GRIM or the FIDAS 11D is not much smaller than the uncertainty of the sensors. That's always something to be kept in mind because we talk about a very indirect measurement principle. And it can be applied if properly calibrated for the exact aerosol. But you mentioned, for example, tailpipe emissions. I'm very skeptical that the sensors can work properly for tailpipe emissions, because the same with other optical devices, because the majority of the tailpipe emissions is simply too small. And even if you have larger emissions, like larger particle emissions, it would still need to be calibrated for this specific aerosol because it's very different compared to what you see in the atmosphere. So as I see, there's lots of limitations that apply to the low-cost sensors. And if you say geographical differences of the results from the different sensors, I mean, that is simply because you have different aerosol properties in the different geographic locations. But I think this should be not so big. This is simply an uncertainty that you have to live with. But when you go to other applications, or you have in the atmosphere very specific local sources which are different from typical sources, then you would always need this extra calibration for them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Okay.
Christof. Yeah.
Thank you.
Considering India being a very vast and diverse country, and every city and state has multiple sources of pollution, and they vary from one location to other. So this question becomes really crucial. Yeah. So yeah, let's see going forward if I mean we can come up with good questions.
Let me add one thing, because you mentioned that every region has very specific sources. If you want to identify these sources, then again, these low-cost sensors are very, very practical. You probably will not be able to determine emission strengths quantitatively, but qualitatively, you see when and where the concentration goes up if you have a dense network of these sensors. And even though the absolute values may be by a factor of 2 off, you'd still see when and where it goes up. And then you can locally and temporally identify sources.
I very much agree to that, like for hyperlocal measurement, because our regulatory monitors are quite costly and the pollution control boards can't afford it. So the next solution is having a hyperlocal network of low-cost sensors.
Exactly. And that's exactly what I meant in the beginning, that we should not overinterpret the data quantitatively, but qualitatively and semi-quantitatively, we can make quite a lot of use of it.
Yeah,
Thanks so much, Christof. Yep.
Okay,
So,
Dr. Sahu, if you allow me, I would like to continue with the question asked by the Pratima.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So means she asked quite a bit of things which I wanted to ask. So part of it is already covered. So Christoph, I just want to understand. See, for a given region, we know from place to place, things are different, composition is different, and your sensors are not calibrated accordingly. So things can be different. But for a given region, sources are similar, right? Means say, for example, one city, Delhi, for example, if we take, we know that sources, we know that these are the major sources of pollution over this particular place. And now you have a network of sensors which can give you the data. So I would like to know, Miss, how frequently one should calibrate to, Miss, rely more on the data. See, what you are saying qualitatively, we will understand that high or low. But Miss, these sensors are shown to give, Miss, not very accurately, but close to accurate data also. If we are able to do the things very, if we can monitor the things. So, for example, if you are making sensors for a given region, if we are buying from some place which is making for a particular region, so how frequently one should calibrate these sensors in order to get kind of reasonably good data?
Okay. I can give you only limited answer to that because I only have some experience. I mean, we've exposed them to fairly high concentrations of titanium dioxide. And we saw that except for one sensor, none of the others really showed any effect. So that's a good sign. But I should mention this was titanium dioxide because it was a project for industrial workplaces where titanium dioxide is one of the main materials that's produced in these workplaces. And the optical properties of titanium dioxide are very different from, for example, soot, which you probably see to a large degree in cities in general, but also in Indian cities. So I assume that the BC concentrations are probably relatively high in Indian cities if you have a general high air pollution. And carbon particles that would deposit in this optical system probably cause a very different effect than titanium dioxide. So I don't know how much we can transfer the information from titania to high ambient concentrations. Now, in the measurements that we've conducted here for about 2 years at our parking lot, where the concentrations are like average, like the concentrations that you've seen in the graphs here, we have concentrations, PM10 concentrations between 20 and maybe 50 micrograms per cubic meter. We've operated for 2 years, and we did not really see yet that they have to be recalibrated. So this is the limited information that I can give you on the need for recalibration of the sensors.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions from the audience? Otherwise, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, one Kritika Sharma, and she has also typed something. So maybe you can say before going to yours.
How appropriate is to use a single calibration factor for all the other sensors in a network?
It's again a question of the uncertainty you can live with and the amount of effort you can put into the calibration. If you can be sure that the calibration, that the properties do not differ too much at the different measurement locations, then a single calibration would be sufficient because we've seen that the sensors react pretty much the same so all the sensors of the same type, when exposed to the same aerosol, they show pretty much the same results. Of course, when you have very different properties, then you would need to calibrate for each measurement location individually. But that means a lot of effort. But again, it's something that not only applies to the low-cost sensors. It also applies to the scientific grade instruments.
Okay. Is there any other questions from audience? Okay, Christopher, I have a few questions. So in my group, we have worked a lot on local sensor, and we have developed physics-based algorithm based on, as well as the Bayesian learning-based algorithm. But one important thing is the calibration factor also depends on the concentration of the particle. You showed that for low concentration, it's very much linear, and for high concentration, it may not be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So always assuming the linear, I don't think is the right approach, because relative humidity will not have a linear effect, right? So it can have
Humidity,
non.
certainly not. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the composition of this also changes significantly, and which again impact the refractive index, right? So it has to be looked into much more details about looking into the compositions, relative humidity. Just linear plotting with respect to the reference grade instrument, I think, is not enough. Probably, maybe good for some of the region, but for India condition, for India, if you go to Delhi or go to any other place, the compositions and the all the different meteorological conditions like relative humidity, temperature, and all these are very entirely different in different seasons. And we have done a significant amount of work by deploying large number of sensors actually, and we see there is a significant difference in the performance itself, because the concentration sometimes 300, 400 microgram per meter cube in winter season. So what's your comment on this? Like the performance in high concentration?
Well, again, we don't have experience for operation in high atmospheric concentrations. We had high concentrations in the lab, and sometimes we had high concentrations in workplaces.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen that the non-linearity of the response actually only starts for the sensors that we looked at very high concentrations, so above 1 milligram per cubic meter.
Mm-hmm.
But it's material dependent, because
Correct.
eventually it's kind of a saturation of the sensor, and the saturation is actually not mass dependent, but it's scattered light intensity dependent, right? So
Correct.
it really depends on the material. In some cases it's higher, in other cases it's lower. And so in our experience, we did not really see in the concentration ranges that we measured, which was always within the specified limits of the sensors, we never really saw a big issue.
Yeah. Okay. And one thing from your presentation, I found so many different sensors have been used, and their performance are very different, right? Starting from plant tower, sense iron, and all this.
Hmm.
But people do not have that good idea that every sensor need a different correction factor. It means, right? It means the every sensor has a different correction factor itself,
Exactly. Hmm.
right? So people
Hmm.
do not have the understanding, and they take the sensor and go and take the measurements and try to report. And this is what is really the concerning. The people who do not understand, just like they take it and do the measurements and try to report. And people should be very much concerned about that. This is what one of the major limitations of using this without having understanding, using the sensor and report something which is can be 700% higher, which is not good, right?
Yeah. Again, it depends on the particle properties,
Yes, of course.
but it can be way off. Yeah, I
Yeah,
totally agree.
yeah.
And so one of the things is when I'm asked, so can we mix different sensor types within one network? I always
Hmm.
say no, because of
Correct.
exactly what you mentioned. Then you use
Right.
one, it's a factor of 5 too high, and the other one that's a factor of 5 too low. And then you
Correct.
would misinterpret this as in some regions the concentration is much higher than in others, even though they probably see the same.
And we have got the same result what you have also presented, that OPCNC, purple layer, which is the plant tower, and
Hmm.
some other sensor we compared with BAM data. And these are reporting completely different results. And when
Hmm.
you talk about the OPS, whatever OPS N2, they give very good performance in terms of size distributions and all this.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So I think there is a lot more work to be done on
Mm.
sensor performance, understanding the algorithm to correct the data, and before it can be applied for regulatory and some more important exposure analysis, I feel.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Yeah, our group has done a lot of work on this sensor algorithm development, so you can look into that. I think some person, Pratima, asked about whether one sensor can be used. I think we have recently published a paper on transferability of the sensor calibration in Delhi. We have used around 22 sensors data, and we have compared with the BAM data, which was established by this thing, and we have looked into the transferability of all this. And what we found out, the sensors which are located in industrial zone, they are transferable easily. And sensors which are located in domestic, what is the residential area, because of the same property that Christof mentioned, they can be transferable in that region itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I should. Did you publish this?
Yes, yes, we have published
Okay.
that actually in
Okay, I
Journal of
should-
Aerosol Science.
Okay, I should look it up.
Yeah.
You may
yeah.
like to share it. Yeah.
Is there any other
Okay.
questions or something? I think we are already beyond the time.
Yeah. So, Christoph, if you don't mind, just 1 or 2 more minutes we will take.
Yes,
Yeah.
I
So
just
now,
have another
yeah.
meeting in a few minutes, but
just 1 minute.
Yeah.
1 minute I will take. So now we are coming at the last part of the talk, which is vote of the thanks. So for that means it is my pleasant duty. First of all, I would wish to thank the staff for kindly agreeing to give this talk and giving such a nice, wonderful, and informative talk. We really appreciate that. Thank you, the staff.
Mhm.
And then we would like to also thank our team who is managing this lecture. Dr. Manish Joshi and his team. I think there is some echo. Can other people mute their mic?
yeah, it's better now.
Okay. Yeah. So so Manish Joshi and his team and Dr. Manoj Sahu means he kindly agreed to handle the question answer session. Thank you, Dr. Sahu. And again means to the audience, because these are the people for whom we are arranging the lecture and they are coming, and I hope they are means getting benefit out of it. So with this, we would like to rest here and thank you, Christoph, once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Manish, I think we can wind up now.